4 revolutions, followed by as many dictatorships or absolutist monarchies in less than a century. The idealism of Romanticism and its eternal values disappointed. Artists focused on the struggle in their own time, on the harsh realities of society. It began the movement known as realism. To understand the avant-garde of the 19th century, we need to see the drive for aesthetic independence in its larger contexts. The 18th century Enlightenment had aimed to replace monarchical absolutism with what Jean-Jacques Rousseau had termed the social contract of democracy, and the French Revolution of 1789 had partially achieved that aim. In art, the Romantic movement grew out of the Enlightenment and aimed to replace the conservatism of classicism with a focus on individual freedom and feelings of connection with nature. The 1790s, however, saw the First Republic overthrown by the Terror and Napoleon's absolutism, and after Waterloo, a series of constitutional or authoritarian monarchies overthrown by popular agitation. The Second Republic of 1848 ended, just as the first had, with a Bonaparte as an emperor, absolute and seemingly unassailable. Hence the idealism of Romanticism became tempered with a sense of the need to address the realities of the present. As Baudelaire put it, beauty is made up of an eternal, invariable element, and of a relative, circumstantial element, which will be, if you like, whether severally or all at once, the age, its fashions, its morals, its emotions. The period of Napoleon III's rule was marked for its conservatism in the arts. The struggle for aesthetic independence thereafter focused on the academicism of the state-sanctioned salon, with its insistence on historical painting and mythological classicism. Jean-Léon Gérôme often depicted the female nude in the presence of clothed men, ostensibly as a reference to a classical or so-called Oriental theme. The radical critic Théophile Thoré attacked Gérôme as the origin of the prevailing caricature of antiquity in the salon. Even depictions of nature were merely vehicles for depicting the moral messages of the classical world. And it was this insistence on the part of the academic salon that Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot found himself rejecting, not in his salon submissions, but in the immediate confrontation of the artist with nature, in his sketches, done in the open air. Corot had focused on the natural world as an uncontroversial arena for his experimentation. In contrast to the excessive mediation of reality by classicism, Corot prioritized the spontaneous perception of nature, stating, "I noticed that everything that was done correctly on the first attempt was more true, and the forms more beautiful." Landscape had been an important genre for the Romantics, but instead of an idealization of nature, Corot used a subjective, intuitive response to counter academicism. In part, Corot's approach to landscape came from northern realism, following Flemish and Dutch landscapes rather than the southern classical interpretations of the Campagna. Similarly, Henri Pierre de Valenciennes had insisted on the virtue of painting en plein air, and by Corot's time, equipment for this purpose was more widely available. Valenciennes had stated that the painter must observe an expanse of country dominated by an area of sky, and seen in the light that falls on it at the exact moment when the painter sets out to capture the scene. And ultimately, this was what Corot, and later Monet, strove to do. Corot was born into an affluent but controlling family. Sent to boarding school in Rouen, although he showed no aptitude for art, he grew to appreciate nature in the company of his father's friend, Monsieur Sénégon. Corot began to paint clandestinely at the family home, and finally requested he be allowed to study art, a request that was not granted until Corot was 26. In spring of 1822, he joined the studio of Achille Etna Michelon, himself a student of Jacques-Louis David, and Corot painted with Michelon en plein air in Dieppe. However, Michelon died in the autumn, and Corot studied instead with another of Michelon's teachers, Jean-Victor Bertin. Corot was critical of Bertin's not teaching him the basics of drawing, but Corot was able to learn the importance in composition of tonal value. As Corot said in his notebooks, published posthumously as part of his Catalogue raisonné, the most important things to study are shape and tonal values. These two things, for me, are the only serious starting points for any study of art. Colour and execution add charm to the work. Kenneth Clark, in his seminal post-war work Landscape into Art, wrote about Corot's perfectly true sense of tone. In this early work, a plein air sketch of the old Saint-Michel Bridge in Paris, the emphasis on tonal value and shape can be seen. Also illuminating is Corot's method for achieving this. Sketch as closely as possible to the colour and go over it with a glaze of clarified poppy seed oil. Lay paint over this glaze after drawing all the masses. The result is a canvas in which fields or areas of tonal value take primacy over the type of finish and detail required by the Academy. Corot eventually left for Rome, living near the Spanish Steps, and each flood of light in the morning sent him into despair at his palette. However, Corot worked on capturing the effects of the southern light, and in this innovation paints a view from the same place, the Farnese Gardens on the Palatine Hill just south of the Roman Forum, looking southeast in the morning towards the church of San Sebastian on the Palatine Hill, looking northeast at noon towards the Colosseum, and looking westwards in the evening towards the Forum itself. Ultimately then, Corot's work represents a spontaneous response by the artist to the landscape, capturing the light through tone. Of the sketches made on Corot's first trip to Italy, Kenneth Clark remarks that they are the most remarkable he ever did, for his excitement shook him into a freedom of handling which he did not allow himself again till his last years. In 1826, Corot moved north from Rome, travelling up the Tiber in Poussin's footsteps, along what was called the Poussin Promenade, visiting the Sabine Mountains, Civita Castellana, and Papigno. From there he travelled to Narni, where he sketched the ruined bridge in oil on paper, using broad, washed areas of tone. It's instructive to compare this with Corot's first attempt to please the Salon jury with his classical idyll of green shade and pastoral figures. In essence, this formed the pattern for much of Corot's production. His studio work, painted from plein air sketches, his studio portraiture, his religious and mythological works lack the spontaneous subjective reaction of the artist to the natural world in front of him, lacks the radical anti-academic focus on tonality, on the artist's intuitive reaction to the changing effects of light, using spontaneous brushwork, which made Corot the precursor of the Impressionist movement. As Corot wrote in his notebook, "Let your feelings be your only guide. The beautiful in art is truth, filtered through the impressions we receive as we see nature." After returning from Italy, Corot continued his practice of plein air painting of nature, travelling south from Paris to the forest of Fontainebleau, an ancient hunting park connected to the chateau of Fontainebleau, then a protected national park. The village of Barbizon, on the edge of the forest, formed a useful base, and became the name of a school of artists, including Théodore Rousseau, Charles-François d'Aubigny, and Jean-François Millet, with the latter two settling there permanently. However, Corot's contribution to realism also consisted of his landscapes, featuring those that the various regimes of the 19th century had refused to enfranchise. As Linda Nochlin points out in her work on realism, the vast majority of the poor and of the labouring force itself was still peasant rather than urban proletariat, and Corot, in common with other realists, depicted landscapes including rural workers. Jean-François Millet, however, was the popular doyen of representations of the agricultural peasantry. But unlike the more politically and aesthetically radical Courbet, Millet did not entirely separate himself from romantic elements, representing his subjects in landscapes with symbolic meaning and transcendental light. Millet was born in Grouchy in Normandy, and it's perhaps in his early years that the seeds of his worldview can be found. On the one hand, Millet was the son of a farmer, and as a child learnt the hardships of labour in the fields, beginning before dawn in all weather. On the other hand, Millet was educated by priests in the village, learning Latin and imbibing the mysteries of the Catholic faith. And many of Millet's landscapes set the foreground of privation against a backdrop of the shining heavens. Millet's early tutors in art in Cherbourg paid a stipend for him to study under Paul Delaroche, and although the academic elements of the master's style left Millet unaffected, the romanticism in the older artist's work left its mark. Despite early successes in the salon with portraiture, eventually Millet settled on the edge of Fontainebleau and began painting the theme that comprised the majority of his work, the rural poor in the Barbizon landscape. This early work, The Sower, shows many of these formal features already in place. The physicality of the sower, the representation of his bony body rejecting the traditional classical canon, gravity pulling his heavy stride down the hill, arm swinging mechanically, eyeless, the thickly scraped facture of the earth-toned paint, the shadowed proximity of the lee side of the hill, all of this deliberately composed in contrast to the otherworldliness of the sunlit distance, with a pair of oxen vaguely depicted pulling a farrow to cover the seeds with earth, a promise of growth and reward. Millet was undoubtedly mindful of Galatians 6. The one who sows to please the Spirit, from the Spirit will reap eternal life. Millet's own writings give us insight into the synthesis of the realistic representation of rural hardship with the romantic transcendent. There are repeated references in his letters about his work to Bible passages regarding the beauty of the rural worker. Thou shalt eat bread in the sweat of thy brow. Even Solomon in his glory was not arrayed like one of these. This reference to religious symbolism, more akin to romantic works like Caspar David Friedrichs, makes Millet the exception among the realists, and is the reason for Vincent van Gogh's use of Millet's motifs, particularly the sower, which he produced a copy of, and which he reused in several works. However, Millet's beauty is not merely romantic. It is the realist beauty which Baudelaire described. As Millet put it, one may say that everything is beautiful in its own time and place. But unlike Courbet, Millet's realistic depictions of the peasantry were not overtly political. Millet refused to join Courbet's left-wing Fédération des Artistes during the Paris Commune of 1871. Again, in Millet's The Potato Harvest, there is the same romantic juxtaposition of the earthly and divine, but tempered through the very realist focus on the momentary, the effects of light of a passing storm. This work, The Gleaners, is among Millet's most well-known works, and Linda Nochlin in the above-mentioned monograph Realism describes the work thus, quote, Millet's composition implies something beyond the fact of specific 19th century peasants performing a routine task, and conveys a comforting suggestion of the timeless, quasi-religious validity and moral beauty of labour in general. These implications and suggestions are conveyed by the formal configuration of the painting, the grandeur of the panorama which stretches out in the background, the reiteration of the bent forms of the three women. End quote. The reiteration refers to the two tall haystacks and one short hay wain, an inversion of the two bent double gleaners with one who is upright. Millet has depicted the realities of the life of gleaners, who, on account of their poverty, were permitted to pick up stray heads of corn missed by the harvesters. Millet depicts the overseer on his horse in the distance on the right, directing the harvesters with outstretched arm, and monitoring the activities of the gleaners. But he is a world away, in the golden sunlight, barely audible. Millet has presented him as a reality, but without relating this poverty and hierarchy to the political conditions of his time. The Angelus is, art historically speaking, perhaps Millet's most engaging work. The work was originally entitled Prayer for the Potato Crop when commissioned in 1857. The work was partly a development from his earlier work, The Potato Gatherers, seen here on the right. After the original patron refused the work, Millet changed the title for resale in 1859 to The Angelus and added a church steeple in the distant village. The Angelus, whose title refers to the Archangel Gabriel, is a prayer narrating the Annunciation and is to be spoken at dawn, noon, and twilight. And it is in these twilit fields that the church bells remind two potato farmers to pray at the end of the working day. In a letter to Simeon Luce from the 16th of March 1865, Millet said, "The idea for the Angelus came to me because I remembered that my grandmother, hearing the church bell ringing while we were working in the fields, always made us stop work to say the Angelus prayer for the poor departed." Hence it was Millet himself that introduced the idea of praying for a lost one, and Salvador Dali's conviction that the work represented the burial of a dead son prompted him to ask the Louvre to X-ray the work, which they did in 1963. The X-ray shows the legs of the man on the left, the woman and barrow on the right, and the basket with potatoes. The strong jagged lines to the left of the woman are from repairs after the work was slashed 5 times by a disturbed attacker in the Louvre. Underneath the basket, the X-ray reveals a geometrical shape, dark in colour, which could be taken to be a child's coffin. However, Millet's worldview is not religious, and neither is it revolutionary. His work is not essentially romantic, despite taking elements from Romanticism, such as ideas of the beauty of man in nature, but neither does it seem to have the typical realist desire to change the rural hardship it portrays. His oeuvre, then, exists in the interplay between these ideals. As Millet put it in a letter of the 30th of May 1863, "I see the sun spreading his glory in the clouds over distant worlds, but nonetheless I see down there in the plain a man quite worn out, surrounded with splendor."